Hey, I'm Daniel from RTINGS.com. Today we'll be doing a review of the Samsung Odyssey Neo G9. We'll be evaluating it on our standardized test bench to see how it performs and if you should buy it. This monitor is the successor to the Odyssey G9 from last year. Check the full model code or look for the Neo branding to make sure you're getting the latest model. Both the old and the new models have a resolution of 5120 by 1440 and a refresh rate of 240 Hz, but this newer version has a mini LED backlight, which we'll talk about in the review. The first thing that stands out for the G9 is the size. It's an ultra-wide monitor with a diagonal size of 49 inches. This might be too much for some, but if you've used a multi-monitor setup, then it's basically equivalent in size and resolution to two 27-inch 1440p monitors side by side, with the advantage of no border as it's a single screen. Consider a replacement for buying two screens. The curve of the screen can also seem intense, but it helps to ensure clear visibility of content on the side and makes it more immersive overall. The stand supports the monitor well, but it's pretty large due to the monitor's size, so it takes up quite a bit of desk space. There's a channel at the back of the stand for cable management, which is nice. If you don't want to use the stand, then there's an adapter in the box for a standard 100 by 100 VESA mount. There's a pretty standard range of inputs, with two HDMI ports and a display port. They're both HDMI 2.1 ports with 40 gigabits per second of bandwidth. You should definitely connect via DisplayPort, as via HDMI the refresh rate is limited to 144 Hz, even with an HDMI 2.1 graphics card. Now let's take a look at the tests. We'll start with the contrast. A high contrast ratio is important if you use the monitor in the dark for deep dark scenes. Unlike most monitors, this one has a VA-type panel. This has some trade-offs, which we'll talk about in the review, but a big advantage is the great contrast. Local dimming is a feature that controls the brightness of individual zones of the backlight. This allows for much deeper dark scenes in things like video games, as the area of dark objects can be further darkened. As a result, the overall contrast can be boosted. The Neo G9 is advertised with mini LEDs, which basically means it has many more local dimming zones than any other monitor we've seen. It has the best local dimming implementation that we've seen on a monitor, and also overall the most impressive dark scenes that we've seen on an LCD monitor. It's beaten only by OLED displays like the LG C1 or the Gigabyte Aorus FO48U. There's not much noticeable blooming, and it even works well with variable refresh rates and when gaming. Now, a high peak brightness is important either in a bright room to counteract glare, or if you want brighter highlights and a more impactful image, especially in high dynamic range or HDR games. This monitor gets very bright, as expected from the mini LED backlight. Now, the brightness does depend a bit on the scene, but it's still excellent for a room with a lot of light. When playing high dynamic range games, the local dimming feature also helps to boost bright highlights, which is excellent. Also important for a bright room is good reflection handling. The Neo G9 has a hazy screen coating that helps to diffuse reflections and reduce their intensity. Overall, bright rooms shouldn't be an issue at all. A potential downside of a hazy coating is that it can cause small details like text to appear grainy. Text clarity is also impacted by a bunch of factors though, like the subpixel arrangement. Overall, it's good, as you can see in these images. The screen coating doesn't seem to have much of an impact. The top photo is with Windows Clear Type, which helps diagonal lines to look more clear. Without Clear Type in the bottom image, it's alright, but does lack some of the subpixel detail. Good viewing angles are important to ensure details at the far sides of the screen don't look washed out. On this monitor, the horizontal angles are a bit less important though, due to the aggressive curve. As the sides of the screen are tilted towards you, the angles are reduced, so while it scores low, it shouldn't really be an issue. There's no vertical curve though, so the poor viewing angles here mean that if the monitor is tilted, then dark scenes can appear washed out. It's not much of a problem though. An overall uniform screen brightness and color is important when playing video games, to avoid distracting areas that are overly dark or bright. This does vary between units, but we expect the G9 that we bought to be about typical. The overall screen has a very similar brightness, which is great and shouldn't be an issue. In dark scenes, there is some backlight bleed, as you can see around the edges of this photo. The local dimming does mean that in very dark scenes, the backlight is just turned off and the bleed isn't noticeable, so this mostly affects bright objects transitioning to black around the edge of the screen. Accuracy in the standard sRGB color space is important, as it's the standard for computer use. This monitor has a specific sRGB color mode, which is pretty good, as it clamps the colors for accuracy and to avoid an oversaturated image. It doesn't come with a factory calibration confirmation though, so as expected, some colors are a bit off, but unless you work with color professionally, you're unlikely to really notice these inaccuracies. If you want to take full advantage of this monitor and display vivid colors in things like high dynamic range or HDR games, then the Neo G9 is a great choice. There was a bug in the first few firmware versions that resulted in an inconsistent HDR experience and scenes that looked way too dark or washed out. This appears to have been fixed in the latest 1007.3 firmware though. A high refresh rate is important for gaming. It allows the image to be drawn on the screen faster, which makes it more responsive, and if the monitor supports variable refresh rates, then you can get a smooth experience without tearing, regardless of the changing frame rate. The Odyssey Neo G9 definitely doesn't disappoint. The 240Hz refresh rate is among the fastest of any monitor, and both G-Sync and FreeSync support means compatibility with new AMD or NVIDIA graphics cards. Just note that if you're going to use the HDMI 2.1 ports, then the monitor is bandwidth limited, as it doesn't support display stream compression or DSC. Basically, it only works up to 144Hz via HDMI. Another important thing to note is that with very dark or low frame rate content, this monitor has an issue where some flicker can be noticeable. It really depends on the person how distracting this is, and there is a VRR control setting that helps, but the trade-off is some stuttering. When playing video games, a fast response time is important for the clearest image without distracting blur. The Neo G9 does have a good result overall, but there is some overshoot that you can see as a light smear to the left of our moving logo. You can't adjust the overdrive setting when adaptive sync is enabled, but the measurement and performance is equivalent to the standard setting, which is also the setting we recommend overall. If the frame rate drops when you're gaming, then luckily the response time is still good. Stick to the standard overdrive setting for the best result, regardless of frame rate. There's still some overshoot, but it's unlikely to be an issue. If you really want the clearest image when playing fast-paced games, then black frame insertion or backlight strobing features are useful to reduce blur caused by the persistence of the image during a full frame. The 2021 Odyssey G9 can flicker the backlight between 120 and 240 Hz, depending on your input signal, which is great for the clearest image. You can still enable it at lower frame rates, but the flicker frequency doesn't go any lower, so you might see duplication of moving objects. You also can't use black frame insertion when adaptive sync is enabled, so you do need to make the trade-off between extra clarity and responsiveness when changing frame rates. Now, a low input lag is really important for a responsive feel when playing video games, and unsurprisingly, this monitor is excellent due to the 240Hz refresh rate. There's a setting on the monitor to adjust its refresh rate between 60, 120 or 240 Hz, so just make sure that it's the same as your PC and you won't have any issues. So this brings us to the main question: should you buy this monitor? Well, firstly, it's definitely an industry-leading package between the high resolution, frame rate, picture quality and size. There's really only the older G9 that ticks some of these boxes. If you can afford it and want the best ultra-wide gaming experience, go for it. Last year's Odyssey G9 is really the closest competitor. The newer model has better picture quality with mini LED backlighting and many more zones and HDMI 2.1 support for higher refresh rate over HDMI. If you only use a PC, then this HDMI 2.1 support doesn't really matter, and in this case, it's not as good as DisplayPort anyway. The mini LED backlighting does really improve the picture quality, but if you're able to get last year's model at a discount, then it can be worth it. On the topic of high-performance gaming monitors, it's worth mentioning the LG C1, which is available in a 48-inch size. It uses a different technology with an OLED panel and has more differences than I can go into here, so check out the video for more information. It's worth considering if you game in the dark or you're after a more traditional 16:9 aspect ratio and don't mind the lower 120Hz refresh rate.